I'd like to say, first of all, this is a thank you to Matt Greenley from HSE, who's actually provided the first half of this presentation for us. For those of you who haven't come across Matt before, Matt works for HSE within their sort of construction section, and he's the welfare portfolio lead. I know Matt has done a lot of work with regards to looking at sort of welfare within construction, which also includes asbestos removal. Asbestos removal usually sort of sits within the sort of construction area anyhow. And although a lot of this will sort of talk about construction and then asbestos removal, it's also quite pertinent to the analytical sector, and particularly people that are carrying out 4-stage clearance testing. So the guidance will sort of impact on everybody. So if we start to look at it and that, well, why is welfare important? HSE over the last sort of number of years obviously have looked into this in quite a bit of detail, and some of the bits that they sort of highlighted is about good welfare being quite a basic requirement for anybody at work, and whenever they come across sites that have got good welfare, it tends to be a barometer for sort of like how well the rest of the site will actually be sort of run and managed. And although I'm sure everybody's sort of quite familiar with large construction sites and everything that you might get on board there, asbestos workers, as I say, sit within that sort of regime as well. So they can't be considered as second-class workers. They do actually deserve decent facilities. And I say it's easier on the large sites where they're already set up with sort of like all the big cabins and sort of like, I don't know, the various amounts of accommodation that you get on site. And you know, we fully appreciate that asbestos workers quite often don't end up with the same sort of facilities because they might be on site sort of prior to the main work starting, but they do still require decent facilities. It's also sort of like a vital control measure as well, against many ill health issues. And you'll see some of the bits towards the end of the presentation where there have actually been sort of prosecutions for individuals becoming ill when there haven't been welfare facilities on site. And obviously asbestos sites, you know, can often be sort of quite remote and lacking sort of fixed or accessible sort of on-site facilities. So all of that has actually been sort of considered as part of sort of like looking at the updated guidance by HSE. Now, the terminology OG is just, it's operational guidance. Operational guidance are usually internal documents produced by HSE for use by their own sort of like internal sort of departments, and particularly for sort of like the field inspectors. The first operational guidance in relationship, or the previous one in relationship to welfare, was produced in 2013. So it was due to be reviewed in 2015. This latest operational guidance, which was issued last year, it hasn't sort of done away with the previous guidance. If anything, it's just sort of enhanced it. It's tried to sort of fill in some of the gaps where there might have been a statement in there, and this is to take away sort of like some of the vagueness, which will obviously sort of like help the inspectors when they're out on site actually inspecting sort of site conditions. But it will also help others to understand what it is that inspectors will be looking for. And although the operational guidance is an internal document, it is something that is available to all stakeholders. It can be requested, and particularly sort of like under sort of like common day freedom of information and things like that. These documents, anybody can ask for them and can be provided with them. As part and parcel of that, HSE have sort of worked with industry stakeholders as well when they've been looking at how to update the operational guidance so that it does reflect what is available and what should be used out there. So it will help, I say overall, it helps when the inspectors actually go out to look on site to see what should be there. But I say it also helps from the other perspective as well, because if an inspector is coming to site, you will already know what it is that they are going to be looking for and what they're going to measure you against. So say in reality, there aren't any sort of major changes other than the fact there's more definition now. There's more details as regards what you should have on site. Some of the bits in particular are about sort of like toilets, and about sort of proximity, sort of like how far, how far should somebody have to travel to be able to use a toilet, and the numbers have been defined a little bit further as well. The ratios for toilets per person have been changed due to the British standards being updated. It used to be one toilet for every 7 people. Now it's one for every 5 people. But one of the other sort of areas where there's a lot more guidance is on the provision of sanitary waste disposal facilities. So the details, which we will cover a little bit later on sort of like CDM Schedule 2, the CDM regulations, they actually sort of give a framework as regards what are the minimum requirements on site. And a lot of this sort of focuses around that. I'm going to say it gives a little bit more meat now. But in addition to that, there's also CIS 59, welfare and construction. It's a little bit out of date. So the comments or the information from HSEs, although that is still a relevant document, you need to bear in mind that some of the information there might just be a little bit out of date, but it will still be relevant. And that previously would have allowed cafes, etc., sort of like your local Tesco's or whatever, to act as a welfare. But that is not something that's recommended any longer. If somebody's going to sort of cite that for welfare, they're going to use the local McDonald's or the local supermarket, that has to be the very last option. There has to be good justification as to why welfare was not actually provided on site. And you'll sort of get the gist as we go through this, that it's going to be pretty difficult to use that as a reason as to why you've not provided some form of welfare on site. Now, I say a lot of this is aimed at the client or the contractor or the principal contractor, but it also applies to the contractors such as the licensed contractor, but also the analytical contractor as well. So you'll see as we start to touch on some of the information, there are requirements sort of like throughout the whole sort of chain as to who's employing who. So one of the big bits is welfare should actually be one of the principles that's sort of considered right at the outset. It shouldn't be something that's an afterthought. Oh, somebody's gone to site. Oh, what have we got on site for them to be able to use? And there will be CIS 59 will be updated to sort of reflect the changes, and particularly with the new operational guidance. So looking at sort of welfare specifically for sort of like the licensed sector, I'm sure quite a few of you will be familiar with updated DCUs, decontamination units, which have sort of welfare options built into them, but also vans. There's quite an abundance of welfare vans that are also available. There have been changes over the last year. Some of you may already be aware or may have attended some of the updates that were provided by HSE to the trade associations within the licensed sector, where there were discussions provided as to why changes were going to be needed and why they were happening. And in order to address some of those, a number of the major manufacturers have started to retrofit units to ensure that they would actually comply. I think one of the biggest, that certainly from my perspective, that I seem to have heard as I've sort of spoken to people, is the addition of different sinks, particularly in DCUs. I know it probably sounds sort of quite minor, but one of the requirements for sinks for washing was that you need to be able to wash up to at least your elbows. So for those of you that have been into any DCUs recently, I thought they look a little bit different. The sinks are a lot bigger now. That's because of the operational guidance and some of the changes that have been introduced. Because you need to bear in mind that these changes are for construction, and say license removal sits within that sort of phase anyway. So if construction is saying they need larger sinks, the DCUs are actually incorporating them now as well. But one of the sort of areas, particularly for analysts, is that the analytical company must ensure that welfare is in place before the analyst is sent to site. I know for those who have got UCAS accreditation, you'll be familiar with sort of like the whole contract review process. Before you accept a job, before the analyst goes to site, there'll be basic questions that you would ask. And it may well be, basic, such as what actually is the job, what type of removal are you doing, what size is the enclosure, etc., etc. So you can build up what you need before you send somebody to site. You need to actually start looking at welfare as well, and including that as to what welfare facilities are available on site for our analysts when they turn up, whether it's male or whether they're female. So that is something that there will be an expectation that you have asked those questions, and that you've been provided with some information. And I think one of the biggies is about being prepared to think differently and challenged what you're told, particularly if you're told, well, we haven't actually got anything on site, or by the time you get there, some of the site might have been dismantled. I am aware that certainly some feedback that's come through so far from the analytical sector is that when analysts are going to site, although they're asking all the pertinent questions and they are being told that facilities are available, when they get to site, they're not actually allowed to use them. And this is more specifically with toilets rather than sort of showering facilities. Quite a few comments where the analyst has gone to site, they've wanted to use the toilet that might have been in the welfare van, or it might have been built into the DCU, but they're actually told, no, you can't use it because we will have to clean it before it goes off hire, and we don't want to clean it, we've already cleaned it once. That is not acceptable. We have fed some of this back to HSE, who are keen to understand if that's happening, because they have said that they will actually go out and try and address that matter as well. And on the back of that, both ARCA and ACAD have actually been asked by HSE to remind their members that welfare and DCUs must be available to the analysts throughout the work without exception. So it's not acceptable to be told, yes, we've got it here, but you just can't use it. So looking at, I know I sort of mentioned a moment or two ago about sort of sanitary waste bins. It's an area that probably, as the title says, it's the big taboo, and about why provide sanitary waste bins for men to use. That historically that's always been considered as, well, that's a female issue. It's a waste of money. Men don't actually need them. The asbestos sector in particular, obviously, is male dominated on the removal side and also on the analytical side. So, if you went back historically, you wouldn't have ever really sort of expected to see a sanitary waste bin within a DCU or within a welfare van. Well, looking at some of the stats, I think they're quite sort of shocking, or they're quite eye-opening. I mean, you only have to look at those there. 20% of men aged 18 to 25 actually suffer from symptoms of urinary incontinence. And then 51% of all men surveyed had suffered from symptoms. If you look at it sort of globally, 25% of men globally will suffer from urinary incontinence over the age of 40. And in the UK, 1 in 25 men will suffer over 40. Historically, you would probably sort of consider that urinary incontinence issues, that's something that only relates to people when they're old. And the workforce generally won't be that old. It'll be predominantly younger people that are out there working. The figures themselves sort of speak for themselves, to show that this isn't actually an issue that affects the aging workforce. It's an issue that affects them right from when they first sort of start. And then looking sort of towards the bottom, some of the other stats that were collected just sort of shows you about how many people were anxious about leaving home for work due to the lack of a place to dispose of sanitary pads. Say it's the big taboo. It's not been sort of discussed previously. It's been something that's always been hidden away. But if you think, if that's something that's going to sort of deter somebody from going to work, or it can result in absences from work, there's a huge knock-on cost from that as well. So that was one of the reasons for sort of including it and pushing it further as well, particularly in the new guidance, that there is a need for sanitary waste bins, and it's a unisex need. It's not just seen as a female need. I suppose from a female perspective, it's probably a little bit frustrating that we should have had them previously anyway. But if this is what it takes for us to get, the right facilities on site, that's fine. And say like the bottom one, 44% said they felt anxious about actually just using public toilets. Because I suppose if they're actually on site, they're at work, the last thing they want to think is actually I've got to nip off site to go and find somewhere where I can dispose of a urinary pad that I've got. But looking at then, well, how does it affect sort of female analysts? I know obviously I've already had my little jibe about from the female perspective, but it also means that if there are sort of unisex sanitary bins provided, it's just one less barrier to anyone using the welfare facilities. It should just make things far more comfortable, where it's not something that's just really discreet. I can't discuss it with anybody else. It should just become part and parcel of what's expected on site. So it should be far more comfortable environment for men and women to be able to work together, and hopefully breaks down some of the sort of like the areas of frustration or even confrontation on site. So obviously with anything, it's looking at what impact will that actually have on site, what sort of cost will that entail. Well, looking at the figures for provision of sort of sanitary waste bins, it doesn't actually cost that much. It's around about sort of £7 or maybe sort of £7 to £10 for a service bin. If you bear that in mind in respect to somebody just not feeling they can go to work because there won't be that facility available, that cost will far outweigh the cost of having a bin provided on site. So it is for the better. So it is, I suppose, a little bit frustrating that it's been driven from this angle, but if we get the right facilities, it's got to be good. So I know I mentioned it at the beginning. Obviously, this presentation was kindly provided by HSE so that we could use it, because HSE, and particularly Matt Greenley, is quite keen that the information is shared and that everybody's made aware of it. And although there has been a lot of work done within the licensed sector, the same hasn't necessarily happened from the analytical sort of viewpoint, and potentially sometimes the clients employing sort of analysts as well. So we just felt that it was important just to sort of try and sort of share it as widely as we could, so that everybody's aware of sort of changes that are happening out there. But this was sort of trying to show you then, well, what would you expect with if you get a visit from a HSE inspector? I mean, I know there's always the, if a HSE inspector turns up, it's, what are they actually going to be looking at? Well, generally, is the work being carried out correctly? But now one of the main sort of starting points is, has welfare provision been provided on all the sites that were inspected? And that the requirement for inspectors is that they actually look at that welfare provision early on as part of the site visit. It's not it would be nice if you had this. It's a requirement that you do actually have it, and that if you haven't provided it, it has got to be some good justification. And at the moment, because of the availability of particularly sort of like welfare facilities, whether it's within a van or whether it's updated DCUs, you would be hard pressed to be able to say we just cannot provide welfare facilities on site. And I know at the beginning when I was talking about CIS 59, that is outdated because it does include a reference to being able to use a cafe, or like some of the local facilities, maybe in a supermarket or the likes. That is not going to be acceptable any longer, because there are facilities out there. Okay, there's a cost for you to hire it in, but that's something that needs to be factored in as part and parcel of sort of planning works and allowing for that. Although this obviously is sort of looking at looking at things from sort of like, if you've sent an analyst to do work on a licensed site, it will be something that would be relevant if you're sending out surveyors as well. If you're sending out somebody where they're going to be on site for a period of time, what welfare provision is in place for them. So it is something that will have a knock-on effect across the whole of the industry. So the inspectors have been sort of given sort of like the full sort of remit that they can enforce quite easily on this, because these are requirements that have to be sort of put into place. So say unless there is some good justification as to why you haven't got facilities on site, the guidance does actually require that there will be toilets, there will be hand basins for washing. Drying rooms are probably more pertinent to sort of construction, but I suppose it might equally be relevant if you're on site for a period of time, if you are actually outside, depending on what the work is and you're getting wet. But HSE's enforcement management model does actually give enforcement expectations. The thought process at the moment is that initially it would be an improvement notice that would be served to bring things up to a compliant state. It's not likely that would be a prohibition notice, because unless there's an imminent health risk, it's more likely it's going to be an improvement notice. But there is the potential for prosecutions if it's a repeated offence. You know, if somebody's done it once and basically they've not learnt the lesson, they could then face prosecution for failure to provide the correct and right welfare facilities. As you say, it is being anticipated that enforcement in welfare matters will increase, particularly now that there is actually clearer information on the standards that are going to be required. For larger clients, and I know I've sort of already touched on it, there is the ability for, you know, things to sort of track back to look at, did the client actually provide what was appropriate? And if they haven't, is it something that's been allowed to happen before? Has this just become part and parcel of, oh, well, when we work for that client, we're never allowed to have this? You know, it may well be where there's not enough room. The client hasn't given us enough room to actually put welfare on site. That is not actually seen as an acceptable excuse. So the client, it is something that needs to be addressed to the client, that you do need to be able to have toilet facilities and washing facilities on site. So say it is a shared responsibility. There will be a legal duty which will be shared by all to ensure that the right welfare is provided on site, but also that it's used as well. And in addition to that, it does need to be in good order. So it needs to be something that's functional and is clean as well. So the summary as part of the HSE slides is that welfare is a vital part of site health and safety. It's not a nice to have. It is something that needs to be provided. The new guidance that has now been produced is there to support the existing legislation. It just makes interpretation easier for the enforcing body, but also for contractors, for anybody who has got to comply. So the operational guidance has tried to remove some of the, so like the grey areas or the vagaries where it's left you thinking, well, okay, what do they mean by we need to provide suitable and sufficient welfare? So it is a shared duty. It goes right from the client all the way through to the end user. And in some instances, it may well be that there's an education piece. You know, the client needs to be educated as to, well, we need this, not just because, you know, our workers, you know, aren't rough and tough and everything else. It is a legal requirement that you need to provide that for them. But also, you know, if you think about it at the end of the day, if you've got decent welfare on site, it gives a good reflection as to what you're actually like. You know, it's the whole thing of, if people are sort of turned out well, it gives a good impression. It's the same with this. If there are decent welfare facilities, it usually smacks of, if somebody's considered it enough to provide that facility on site, they will have given the same sort of consideration to how they work and the standard of work as well. And say good and compliant welfare should be child's play, but we do still have a fair way to go. And as sort of mentioned a moment ago, a lot of this is about trying to sort of share that information so that nobody's left thinking, well, I didn't know about that. I didn't know anything had changed. I know we can quite often get sort of wrapped up in our own little worlds, and things can be going on around us that we just don't know about. So it is one where we do need to sort of share the information because it impacts on us across the whole of the asbestos sector. So it is something that there is HC have already accepted there is a reasonable way to go. I think you would probably all agree that the large organisations or the large construction sites, you turn up to those and they've always got, you know, multiple cabins on site, whether they're used as office accommodation or, you know, big canteens, you know, areas to make drinks, warm food up, drying rooms, nice sort of toilet facilities, washing facilities. As you come down, I suppose, the food chain onto like the smaller jobs and whatever, those facilities, you know, quite often are non-existent. So this is sort of trying to sort of like drive it now from we need to get right to the bottom of the food chain so that there is at least a minimum, you know, sort of standard that will be present on site when people go out to work. So say looking at that, you know, what does that mean actually for the analyst? Because that sort of first presentation was one that was kindly provided by HSE, so that we could try and support in trying to get the message out there. And although it sort of focused quite heavily on what the contractor should be provided, it was then important to look at, well, how does that actually affect the analyst and particularly the employer of the analyst? I know I've already sort of talked over these welfare facilities. Yeah, they've got to be provided. It's not an optional or a nice to have. It is a legal requirement. They must also be accessible and available to be used. I say there are organisations at the moment that are having problems, you know, with their analysts being allowed to use the facilities when they get to site. So they are in a bit of a catch-22 situation at the moment. Do they say to the contractor, well, we're just never going to come and work for you again? Or, you know, do they sort of address it further? And they are one of the organisations that are trying to sort of take it further as well, because HC have said they are keen to know if people are being restricted or prevented from using facilities on site. But one other sort of interesting bit as well is if they're not clean, they're not actually acceptable. We did raise this a little while ago in a discussion with Matt Greenley about sometimes you go to site and yes, the facilities might be there and they might be available for you to use them, but would you want to use them because of, you know, they've not been cleaned, or sometimes it's a toilet, and particularly, you know, you get some sites where the toilets are labelled male and female, and the female toilets are used more for storage than anything else. You can't get into them because there's that much stuff that's been dumped in there. That's not acceptable. That's not a facility that's readily available and accessible to be used. But interestingly, and I know I sort of touched on this sort of slightly quite at the sort of start of the HC presentation, there has been at least one prosecution under the failure to provide welfare facilities. Say that it was the focus of a HC court case from November 2022 at Cannock Magistrates Court. There was an employee on site that became seriously ill and contracted a blood infection due to having no on-site welfare facilities. So their employer was actually prosecuted for that. They pleaded guilty to breaches under the Health and Safety at Work Act Section 2 and also the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regulations, Regulation 20. They were fined at £126,100 plus substantial costs of over, well, nearly £44,000. So quite a big one, but say things like that, don't necessarily sort of get broadcast within our sector. And that it wasn't an asbestos case, but it was about the lack of welfare facilities on site that had resulted in somebody being unable to, use washing facilities, and then they became ill. So it's always sort of useful to sort of focus your mind as to, what could the potential impact be. Well, that's quite a real one. So other sort of considerations as well, licensed asbestos removal works, do they actually comply? I'm thinking probably more so the smaller jobs, like the one-day jobs. It's the one-day jobs quite often are the ones where I suppose in some regards are more problematic for lots of reasons. One day job doesn't give somebody very long to even get to site to set it up, to do the removal works, let alone then have an analyst come to site to do a 4-stage clearance. So certainly in my experience, one day jobs, I don't know, it seemed to be right at the bottom of the food chain as regards what's sort of provided on site. And invariably, quite often, the welfare facilities on those are non-existent because you're only there for a day. So, it's an additional cost to try and provide some welfare facility, etc., etc. It doesn't matter what the size of the job is. These requirements are applicable for all of them. If we look specifically under the CDM regs and Schedule 2, that's where the minimum requirements for welfare facilities come from. Because as a licensed asbestos removal is governed by lots and lots of different sort of regulations. We all sort of quite readily sort of consider CAR being the main regulator, but CDM regulations have loads of asbestos related requirements in there, but they are the ones that are sort of probably the meat for the welfare facility requirements. So if we have a look at sort of like the welfare facility part from the CDM regulations, this is part of Schedule 2, which has the minimum welfare facilities required for construction sites. That schedule talks about provision of sanitary conveniences, washing facilities, changing rooms and lockers. It's this schedule that the operational guidance will sit under as well, where it's giving you a bit more detail as to how many toilets you have to have on site. And one thing that I suppose I didn't mention before, it also talks about what the distance should be from where somebody works to the maximum distance to where a toilet should be. The maximum distance on a site from where a worker is to where they can access a toilet is 150 metres. So it's quite a distance, but it's not that far sometimes when you consider some of the large sites that people might work on, and they've got quite a journey to get to the toilet set up. So there will be the introduction of lots of sort of like mobile toilet facilities on those sorts of sites, but also the 150 metre distance. It's been acknowledged that sometimes you might not be able to put a mobile toilet somewhere. You might have to drive to the toilet, but the HSE have sort of specified that if you have got to drive to a toilet, the length of time it takes to drive to the toilet should be equivalent to how long it would take you to walk 150 metres. So, for example, if it would take you 2 minutes to walk 150 metres, the driving shouldn't be any more than 2 minutes to get to the nearest toilet. So there are quite a few sort of extra sort of details in there that give that little bit more, rather than just you must have toilets and you must have one for every so many workers. It also tells you how far apart is the maximum that there can be. So looking at obviously welfare facilities specifically for licensed work, that will usually be the DCU. That will normally be your sort of washing and changing facilities. Sometimes it will now have a toilet in there as well. Some of the DCUs have toilets, or it may well be a welfare van in addition to the DCU. So there are bits where the licensed sector over the last year or so, units have been developed further to comply with these requirements. So Looking at sort of like the washing facilities, I know I have sort of mentioned this sort of comment before, but this is taken specifically from the CDM requirements, where it basically says separate facilities must be available or must be provided for men and women, except where they are provided in a room, the door of which is capable of being secured from inside, and the facilities in each room are intended to be used by only one person at a time. Then obviously there's additional bits about the changing rooms and the lockers, identifying obviously that the facilities must be sort of sufficient, and about they must be readily available, but also the ability to be able to lock things away. But if we then look, washing facilities capable of being secured from the inside and intended to be used by only one person at a time. If we then factor in decontamination units, you cannot secure them from the inside. They are used by more than one person, usually at a time. So in theory, the older, and even on the vast majority of times now, even existing DCUs do not comply, because they're not lockable from the inside. So that is an area that has been under consideration, certainly for the last year or so, when it was sort of raised that we have all these sort of CDM requirements, and we have specific things that people have to comply with, but we've got decontamination units that may well have washing facilities in there, but if we look at how they're actually being used, they don't comply, because you can't actually lock them from the inside. So, as I say, it is something that's been sort of flagged. Female analyst working group. It's one of the areas that has been sort of, well, I suppose, beating the drum about for a period of time now. And we do have a number of sort of like the main manufacturers and suppliers who have started to appreciate this and realise it. I know I've spoken previously about one of the suppliers, Beacon, having done a prototype with a new electronic magnetic locking system where the analyst or anybody that was inside could actually activate the locking system just with a switch once they went inside, whether it was the clean end or the dirty end, so that they had complete control of the unit inside. And there was an indicator light as well to let others know that somebody was in the unit, which was why it was locked. That, although that was something that it's more than a year ago since Beacon actually produced that, there wasn't actually any uptake on it. I think a lot of that was because nobody fully appreciated why there was a need for it. So we're hoping now that, particularly with the new guidance as well, that will help to sort of start to drive some of those changes. But one of the more recent ones is from SMH. SMH did develop a unit, a bespoke unit for one of their clients. That unit itself has quite a few sort of alarm systems in there. It has an alarm activation in all three stages. It has one in the dirty end, the clean end, and the shower end. Initially, it's been developed so that the alarm is at quite low level. The intention being, well, if somebody collapsed, if they were overcome, by, I don't know, gases or whatever, they could actually get to the alarm quite easily and activate it. It wasn't necessarily sort of, I suppose, developed with sort of female analysts in mind 100%. But that alarm system also has a battery backup. So even if somebody unplugs it, the alarm will still go off. And it does ring at, I think I was told, at 100 decibels outside. So it is something that's loud, and you would know if somebody had activated the alarm in there. After a recent meeting with SMH, they are now looking at the issue around these units still being accessible from the outside, because they still operate with the old sort of pin pad, the key code locks, so that when somebody's inside, the unit will not be locked from the inside. So again, it doesn't actually comply with the requirements of the CDM regulations. Obviously, with this being sort of part of the female analyst working group, it was looking at it from the risk to the female analysts on site as well, and other people entering the unit whilst the female analyst was in there. But it is good that we have got some of the main manufacturers now actually starting to look at this and take these sort of issues on board, from looking at it from the whole perspective of complying with sort of like the updated operational guidance, complying with the CDM regulations, but also complying with the fact that there is a huge amount of risk and abuse that happens with female analysts on site as well. So I feel that we're getting to a stage now where we're starting to get a lot more sort of joined up thinking, where people from different sort of sides of the sector are coming together to look at, well, okay, we have got all these different sort of issues out there that we need to try and address. So hopefully as time goes on, we will start to see a lot more progress in those areas. But say the issues, particularly sort of abuse of analysts on site. And I know I've drawn on sort of female analysts in particular, but I'm fully aware that, it's not just female analysts, it is male analysts as well. But literally anything, if we can get an improvement for female analysts, it will benefit all analysts anyway. But the licensed sector has sort of started to acknowledge the issues and the abuse of analysts on site as well, which is good. So if we look at it, a lot of these changes, we do need the industry to drive them. Although, it would be nice to have a lot of regulatory change to force things through. That's not necessarily going to happen. HSE don't necessarily have an appetite at the moment to make too many changes to sort of regulations because of the constraints that they're actually under. But the industry has now seems to have opened its eyes that they have a moral and legal obligation to actually start to look at what the issues, what do we need to change, because if we all work together, we should be able to make a difference. I've also put on there client driven for the same reasons, clients, moral and legal obligations, there is so much evidence out there now of the issues that are happening on site. So from a moral perspective, we need to do something, but also from a legal perspective, as we've gone through like the couple of presentations, there are enough sort of legal requirements as to why we need to make changes. But also the analyst organisations, we need there to be a process in place to support staff as well, to support staff that may not have the right facilities on site, may not be treated in the right way, but also for analysts as well, looking at this from the analyst perspective. Only yesterday I received an email where somebody was reporting an analyst and the abuse that they were suffering. It had started sort of like online through sort of Facebook, but sort of continued whilst they were on site, but they didn't feel that there was anybody they could speak to. Which I think quite often is the case. She did feel it was a case of, oh, well, you just got to shut up and put up. This is the job. You just need to get on with it. Fortunately enough, she did finally sort of speak to somebody about it. But I know I've recently sort of reissued information on LinkedIn about there is a confidential email, that acts as sort of like a helpline as well. So if analysts are feeling that they're in a situation where they have nobody else to speak to, the email address that's on the screen, say, is confidential. So sometimes just having somebody to speak to does help, but also being made aware of some of the changes that are actually happening and some of the bits that are being worked on behind the scenes as well. So we will be sort of sharing that email periodically as well, just so that we can try and get it out as far and wide as possible. So, because I can't see anything in the chat section on my screen, so I don't know if there is. I'm having my trusty IT support here help me.
Hi, Colette. There should be a couple of questions in the Q&A. Some people are having issues accessing it, but they are asking in chat if they can't get through there. I think we've got 2 questions at the moment. Can you see those? One is from me, because I've asked on behalf of someone else, and one was from Neil Hardy a while ago.
If you know where they are, do you want to read them out, Brett?
Okay, no problem. So a while ago, Neil Hardy was asked, what about asbestos surveys, and does that sort of apply as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably sort of covered that after you'd asked, Neil. It will be applicable. It's anybody that you are sort of sending to site, you need to include what the welfare provision is for them being on that site. The operational guidance should give you more detail in there. Because I say it goes into sort of like the depth, such as, you know, facilities that can be used and whatever. And although it's not ruling out 100% that you couldn't use local facilities such as the toilets at a McDonald's or whatever else, it will take you through the steps as to how you would need to justify that. So yeah, it's the welfare guidance is applicable for everybody that's out at work. So yeah, surveyors will sort of fall under that regime as well.
Okay, we had another one which was a suggestion really that we could recommend to HSE that a lack of access to welfare for analysts would be a stage 1 failure.
Yes, yeah, I suppose that is something. It's certainly one that I think it would be worth sort of raising at some of the HSE meetings. There is, as part of the asbestos network, there's the analysts and surveyors subgroup, the working group. So it might be one to actually raise through that, because, you know, see, HSE are represented on that group, and so are UCAS as well. Because I think for things like that, it's important to have both those stakeholders involved. But yeah, it's, if it is something that is a legal requirement, yeah, if you go to site and it's not available, yeah, whether or not, you know, in theory, if you follow the operational guidance to its letter, you should be refusing to do the work, is how I see it. So yeah, in which case you would end up having to fail it at some point, and probably right at the start. But it's certainly one worthwhile raising, getting their viewpoint on it. They may come back with something else, but I don't know. I'll definitely ask the question though. I think I saw something flash up before where somebody said, were the slides going to be available? Yeah, the slides will be available. I think there's also recording as well that we will have, so that people can have a look again afterwards.
So another question, what type of things should we be considering as part of risk assessment for a new female analyst?
Oh gosh. I suppose if this is sort of like when you're sending them out onto site, I know, on a sort of slight sort of tangent to this, when probably, I mean, the female analyst working group was set up at the end of 2021. It was, I suppose, sort of quite a new concept, because the asbestos sector hasn't really changed. I mean, I've been in it for over 40 years, and it's always been pretty much the same. The sort of DCU you'd have on site and everything else, and even sort of like predominantly how the work's carried out. I know we've had some upgrades in sort of like making sure things are wet and the sort of equipment that's used, but the task itself has sort of remained fairly sort of consistent. And you know, the fact that an analyst has to come at the very end to sort of sign it off. So to start flagging up the issues then, particularly sort of like the abusive issues that were happening on site, I think it was almost this must be something from the past. You know, it can't be something that now occurs, whereas it is, you know, we get reports on a regular basis now of the sorts of abuse and issues that are happening. Some of it you might just sort of deem as a bit of banter, but it can be offensive. Others are a lot more blatant than that. It's a lot more sort of sexist verbal comments, but even sort of physical abuse as well. So I think, and I'm guessing particularly because it's such a male-dominated sort of sector, and lots of organisations are run by males, whether it's the analytical side or whether it's the license side. So trying to get that message across wasn't an easy sort of ask in the beginning, because it's almost, this is quite alien, we haven't changed anything for years, so why are you suddenly raising this as an issue? But we do seem to have had a fair bit of traction now, particularly over the last sort of couple of months. But I know when I sort of flagged the bit about the DCUs not being compliant because you can't lock them from the inside, the first comment that was made was, well, if they're lockable from the inside, what happens if somebody collapses? You've now locked them inside, you've created another risk, etc., 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 which, is something that needs to be taken on board. But it's part of any risk assessment process. If you can't eliminate or if you can't eradicate the risk, you then look at what mitigations you put in place. But my sort of comment back to that was, well, if we look at, normally you would look at the hierarchy of risk. So you tackle your biggest risks first, and some risks in the end, you might have to come up with something that's quite significant, but it's quite a remote chance of that risk being realised. And if we look at the frequency at which people are being abused, and people are coming into shower units whilst you've got females in there getting changed or showered, quite often it's innocent, but quite often it's not innocent either. It's done intentionally. That is actually happening on a daily basis. I'm not necessarily to every analyst every single day, but that is happening on a daily basis at the moment. If we then look at how often does somebody pass out in the DCU, I am not aware of it. I've been in the industry before. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, and it may well be that it's just not really reported, but I've been on plenty of sites over the years, and I've never known anybody on any of those sites pass out in a DCU. So yes, it is something that could still happen, but it's quite remote. So surely we should be tackling the biggest risk first, which is the abusive one. And if somebody does pass out, you would have to build something else in, such as like SMH have now got this alarm system. If it came to it, we have licensed work inside a removal enclosure. If somebody passes out in there, you actually cut the sheeting and you get in to get them out. So there are always sort of ways around it. But as regards like looking at your risk assessment for your female analyst going out to site, I would certainly be considering things such as, which company is it that she's working with? I'm sure we're all quite familiar with that. Some companies are better than others. Some companies you might have a better relationship with their senior management, so that if there were any issues on site, you have got that process to report it. But also the risk assessment, I would say, just also needs to include, does that analyst feel safe? Have they got somebody they can speak to if there was an issue? Have you got something in place? Have you got a policy that works? Have you got, an area where they feel that they can speak about their concerns? Sometimes, they might be completely valid concerns. Sometimes it just might be where they need a little bit of reassurance. Other areas that we're currently working on as well is on whether or not analysts always have to get undressed when they go to do clearance. Looking at what's the risk to them, because that's the reason why they're undressed. The HSE expectation has never been that the analyst will always have to shower. It's there as an option if they want to, but it's only been in certain circumstances which they risk assess. But the requirement was they had to be in a position where if they felt they'd become contaminated, they could shower. So we have been working a lot on that, and we have got some guidance which hopefully within by the summertime we will be able to release, which will give other options whereby the analyst doesn't always have to strip off completely. So again, that would be something that you could sort of factor in. But part of your risk assessment for the analyst as well would be them having additional training on how do they assess the risk when they get to site as well. So I don't know if that sort of helped enough but or just giving you a few other sort of things to think about when you're sort of considering if you're training up a female analyst. But I say it will apply to all analysts as well.